On the morning of October 25, 1944, an American sailor aboard the escort carrier USS St. looked up and watched a single Japanese fighter plane drop out of the clouds, ignore every evasive maneuver the ship attempted, and fly directly, deliberately, into the flight deck. The pilot never tried to eject. He never tried to pull up at the last second the way every other attack run in the history of naval warfare had trained sailors to expect. He flew the plane straight down into the ship on purpose. And 30 minutes later, the St. was on the bottom of the ocean along with more than 100 of her crew. Nobody watching that morning had a word for what they'd just seen, because nothing like it had ever been used as a deliberate, organized military strategy before. Within weeks, the world would learn the word the Japanese military had already chosen for these men: Kamikaze, divine wind. And by the time the war ended less than a year later, close to 4,000 young Japanese airmen, many of them barely out of high school, had flown planes into American ships on missions where survival was never part of the plan. To understand how a nation reached the point of sending its own sons on missions with no way home, you have to go back 7 centuries before any of this happened, to a moment the Japanese military would later twist into propaganda for an entirely different war. In 1274, and again in 1281, Mongol invasion fleets under Kublai Khan attempted to conquer Japan, launching what should have been unstoppable armadas carrying tens of thousands of soldiers across the Sea of Japan. Both times, as the fleets approached, massive typhoons rose up and annihilated them, sinking ships by the hundreds and drowning entire invasion forces before a single decisive land battle could even take place. Japanese chroniclers called those storms kamikaze, the divine wind, a phrase that carried centuries of meaning about a nation protected by forces beyond ordinary human control. That two-word phrase sat quietly in Japanese cultural memory for nearly 700 years, waiting for a moment desperate enough to resurrect it. That moment arrived in October 1944. In the middle of a naval disaster the Japanese military had no realistic way to reverse through conventional means. By that point in the Pacific War, Japan's carrier fleet had been gutted, its most experienced pilots killed in earlier campaigns, and the aircraft still available were increasingly outmatched by newer American fighters flown by better-trained crews. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, Japan was facing the very real possibility of losing the Philippines entirely, a defeat that would cut its forces off from the oil fields in the East Indies that the entire war machine depended on. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly placed in command of Japan's first air fleet in the Philippines, looked at what remained of his forces and made a calculation that would define the final year of the Pacific War. He had a small number of aircraft and even fewer skilled pilots left. A conventional bombing run against a heavily defended American carrier had a low chance of success, and an even lower chance of the pilot surviving to fly again anyway, given how outmatched Japanese aircraft had become. Onishi's brutal logic was that if a plane loaded with explosives was going to be shot down regardless, its only remaining value was as a guided weapon, deliberately flown into an enemy ship at the exact moment of impact rather than released as a bomb from a distance that gave American gunners time to react. It's worth pausing on something that rarely gets mentioned in the popular telling of this story. Onishi did not walk into this decision as a fanatic. Multiple accounts from officers who served alongside him describe a man who had actually opposed suicide tactics earlier in the war, someone who reportedly called the entire concept heresy when it had been informally proposed by lower-ranking officers months before. But the loss of the Mariana Islands earlier in 1944 had shattered any remaining strategic options, and facing direct orders to stop American carriers from supporting an invasion he had no other way to prevent, Onishi reversed himself completely. On October 19, 1944, at Mabalacat Airfield near Manila, he gathered pilots from the 201st Navy Flying Corps and proposed organizing what he called special attack units, aircraft loaded with bombs and flown directly into enemy ships. He told the men in that room that their nobility of spirit would keep the homeland from ruin even in defeat, language that reveals exactly how this program was framed from its very first hour. Not as tactics, but as sacred sacrifice for a nation already staring down the possibility of total defeat. 6 days later, on October 25th, that same unit flew the mission that sank the USS St. And the tactic that Onishi had proposed almost apologetically less than a week earlier became, almost overnight, An official Japanese military strategy stretched across every remaining theater of the war. By the end of the fighting at Leyte Gulf alone, kamikaze attacks had sunk 5 American ships outright and inflicted serious damage on 23 more, numbers that stunned a Navy which had spent years developing defenses against conventional torpedo and bombing runs, none of which accounted for an enemy pilot who had no intention of surviving the attack in the first place. Here's the detail that turns this from a strategic footnote into something far darker and more psychologically complicated, because the story doesn't end with a desperate admiral's tactical decision in October 1944. It ends with an entire training and recruitment system built over the following months, specifically to produce a continuous supply of young men willing to fly those missions. And the machinery behind that system reveals just how far Japan's military leadership was willing to reach into its own population to keep this campaign running. Conventional Japanese pilot training before the war had taken well over a year, producing aviators with deep tactical skill who could dogfight, navigate, and adapt under pressure. The kamikaze program had no time or resources for anything close to that standard, and frankly, it didn't need those skills anymore because a pilot flying directly into a stationary target didn't need to master aerial combat. What he needed was the ability to take off, hold a heading, and locate his target, and Japan's military restructured training almost entirely around that narrower, grimmer skill set. Many recruits received only a few weeks of flight instruction before being assigned to a unit, spending far more of their preparation time studying target silhouettes and memorizing the specific shapes of American aircraft carriers and destroyers than actually learning to fly. Instructors emphasized absolute obedience and the cultural weight of self-sacrifice above almost everything else, because the program's entire success depended less on technical skill than on a pilot's willingness to complete a mission that had exactly one possible outcome. And here is where the human reality of this program becomes almost unbearable to sit with honestly. The men filling these cockpits were overwhelmingly, shockingly young. Historical accounts consistently describe many of these pilots as barely out of school, teenagers pulled from university classrooms and accelerated pilot programs, some with only weeks of total flight experience before their first and only combat mission. Japan's military framed volunteering for these units as an honor, and the cultural and institutional pressure surrounding that framing was immense. Bushido, the centuries-old code of the samurai built around loyalty, honor, and willingness to die rather than accept dishonor, had been woven into Japanese military education for years by this point, and refusing an assignment framed as the ultimate expression of that code carried a social and professional cost that few young men in that rigid military culture felt able to accept. Some pilots genuinely volunteered, driven by a sincere belief that their deaths might protect their families and their homeland from an invasion everyone could see coming. Others faced a much colder reality that in a culture built around conformity and honor, refusing when your entire unit had already agreed to go meant facing a kind of social death that, to some of these young men, felt scarcely different from the physical one waiting for them in the cockpit. The letters these pilots left behind, many preserved in Japanese museums today, tell a story far more complicated than either the wartime propaganda or the post-war caricature ever allowed. Some letters read exactly the way the imperial government wanted them to, full of duty, honor, and confidence that their sacrifice would matter. But plenty of others reveal something rawer sitting just beneath that surface. A young pilot named Ryoji Uehara, killed in a kamikaze mission in May 1945, left behind a letter that has become one of the most widely read documents of the entire campaign, one that expresses deep sorrow at dying so young alongside open doubt about the war's actual purpose. Written by a man who had studied economics at university and clearly understood, with a clarity that must have made his final weeks almost unbearable, that he was being asked to die for a cause he wasn't entirely convinced was worth dying for. That letter survived because Uehara, like thousands of other pilots in his position, needed someone outside the rigid chain of command to actually send it home for him. That's where a woman named Tome Torihama enters this story, and her role reveals just how much of this program's final human moments happened far outside the official narrative the Japanese government wanted told. Torihama ran a small restaurant called the Tomiya Shikudo near the Chiran Air Base in southern Japan, a facility that became one of the primary launch points for kamikaze missions in the final months of the war. When the base opened, Her restaurant became the designated dining hall for the young pilots stationed there. And over the following months, as wave after wave of teenagers and young men arrived at Shiran knowing they would fly their final mission within days or weeks, Torihama became something the military structure itself could never provide, an actual mother figure in the last days of their lives. She fed them, she listened to them, and crucially, she took their final letters, the raw, unfiltered ones they couldn't risk submitting through official military channels for fear of censorship or discipline, and mailed them home herself, preserving words that might otherwise have been edited or destroyed entirely. Pilots reportedly returned to her restaurant again and again in their final days, some specifically asking to see her one more time before their scheduled departure, and accounts describe her standing at the edge of the airfield, waving handkerchiefs as planes took off on missions everyone present understood would never come back. She earned a nickname that stuck for the rest of her life, the Mother of Kamikazes, and after the war she spent decades of her own life building a memorial temple and eventually a museum dedicated to preserving the actual stories, in the pilot's own words, of who these young men really were before history flattened them into either heroes or fanatics. The departure ceremonies themselves became a fixture of the campaign's final year. Ritualized moments loaded with cultural symbolism that reveal exactly how deliberately the imperial government tried to frame these missions as something closer to sacred ceremony than military operation. Pilots were given a final cup of sake before boarding their aircraft, a traditional gesture of honor and farewell. Many wore a hachimaki, a white headband inscribed with characters meant to convey courage and resolve, the same style of headband worn by samurai warriors centuries earlier heading into battle. Cherry blossoms became the unofficial symbol of the entire campaign, chosen deliberately because a cherry blossom's beauty is defined by how briefly it lasts before falling. A metaphor Japanese propaganda leaned on relentlessly to frame these young men's short lives as something beautiful rather than tragic. Some kamikaze units were even named directly after the flower, and pilots sometimes carried blossoms with them into the cockpit on their final flight. It's an image that has become almost iconic in the decades since, and it's worth sitting with how deliberately that imagery was constructed by a government that needed young men to believe their deaths carried poetic meaning rather than simply representing a desperate military that had run out of better options. By the spring of 1945, as American forces closed in on Okinawa in what would become the largest and bloodiest amphibious campaign of the entire Pacific War, the kamikaze strategy reached its absolute peak in both scale and desperation. Japan launched more than 400 kamikaze sorties during the Okinawa campaign alone, organized into massed attack waves the Japanese military named Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums, another deliberately poetic name draped over an operation that, at its core, was throwing waves of young men and increasingly obsolete aircraft directly into the most heavily defended naval fleet ever assembled. Roughly 350 Allied vessels were struck during the Okinawa campaign, with 47 ships sunk outright and hundreds more damaged, sometimes catastrophically. More than 7,000 Allied naval personnel were killed defending against these attacks. Sailors who spent their days and nights watching the sky for planes that, unlike every other threat in the history of naval combat, had no intention of turning away. It was during this period that Japan's military engineers pushed the entire concept of the suicide weapon even further, developing a purpose-built aircraft called the Ohka, meaning cherry blossom, a small rocket-powered glider that carried no landing gear and existed for exactly one purpose. Carried into range by a larger bomber and released near its target, the Ohka's pilot would ignite its rocket engines and dive toward an enemy ship at speeds that could reach nearly 600 miles an hour in its final plunge, far faster than any conventional aircraft of the era, specifically engineered to be almost impossible to intercept once its final dive began. American sailors, with a dark humor that reflects exactly how terrifying these weapons actually were, nicknamed it baka, the Japanese word for fool or idiot, a small act of psychological defiance against a weapon designed purely to inspire dread. The Ohka never sank a significant number of major warships and proved vulnerable during the vulnerable approach phase before its final dive, but its mere existence, an aircraft built with literally no mechanism for its pilot to survive under any circumstance, marked a disturbing escalation in how far Japan's military had traveled from its original 1944 justification of using otherwise doomed planes more efficiently. American sailors on the receiving end of these attacks developed their own particular relationship with fear during this period, one that differed fundamentally from anything conventional naval combat had prepared them for. A torpedo or a conventional bombing run was a threat you could evade through skillful maneuvering, a danger that a well-handled ship might reasonably survive by simply being faster or smarter than the weapon coming at it. A kamikaze pilot adjusted his approach specifically to counter evasive maneuvers, correcting his dive at the last possible second because, unlike a bomb released from altitude, he was still flying the weapon himself all the way to the moment of impact. Gunners on picket destroyers stationed around Okinawa, tasked with providing early warning and absorbing the first waves of these attacks before they reached the main fleet, described a specific, grinding psychological toll that built up over weeks of duty. Watching wave after wave of aircraft appear on the horizon and knowing that, unlike almost any other enemy in military history, these pilots could not be deterred, only destroyed before they reached their target. Some of the most harrowing accounts from Okinawa come from ships like the destroyer Laffey, which endured attacks from 22 separate kamikaze aircraft in a single engagement in April 1945, shooting down all but a handful before those remaining planes struck home, leaving the ship battered almost beyond recognition, but somehow still afloat. A testament to just how much punishment American damage control crews were forced to absorb during this final phase of the war. Despite the terror these attacks generated and the very real toll they took, the campaign's overall military effectiveness fell dramatically short of what Japan's leadership had hoped to achieve when Onishi first proposed the tactic. American forces adapted quickly, developing improved radar picket lines to provide earlier warning, concentrating anti-aircraft fire more effectively, and refining fighter interception tactics specifically to catch kamikaze aircraft before they ever reached striking range. Across the entire campaign, Japan expended roughly 2,600 aircraft in kamikaze attacks, taking with them the lives of approximately 4,000 airmen. And while the human and material cost inflicted on American forces was genuinely severe, no kamikaze attack ever sank a fleet carrier or battleship. The strategically decisive vessels that Japan's military had originally hoped this desperate tactic might reach. Japan's leadership had gambled that the psychological shock and mounting casualties might break American resolve and force a negotiated peace rather than an unconditional surrender. That gamble failed completely. If anything, the campaign's brutality hardened American determination and factored directly into the decision-making that led to the war's final, catastrophic conclusion in August 1945. When Japan's surrender finally came, Vice Admiral Onishi, the man whose desperate calculation at Mabalakat airfield had set this entire campaign into motion, did something that reveals just how heavily the weight of what he'd built pressed on him once the fighting actually stopped. On the night of August 15, 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, Onishi committed ritual suicide in his Tokyo quarters, following the traditional practice of seppuku. But he made one deliberate, almost unbearable choice in how he carried it out. Traditional seppuku included a second, a kaishakunin, standing ready to deliver a swift, killing blow immediately after the ritual disembowelment, sparing the person from prolonged suffering. Onishi refused that mercy entirely, choosing to die slowly over the course of roughly 15 hours from his self-inflicted wounds, a decision that friends and biographers have since interpreted as a deliberate act of penance, a man forcing himself to feel, in his own final hours, something approaching the suffering he had sent thousands of young men to endure in theirs. His suicide note, discovered afterward, contained a direct apology to the nearly 4,000 pilots he had ordered into those cockpits, alongside a plea to Japan's surviving young people to work toward rebuilding the nation and pursuing peace rather than repeating the path that had led to so much death. The way Japan has chosen to remember these men in the decades since the war reveals just how unresolved this history remains, even generations later. The pilots themselves are memorialized at Shiran with a tone of quiet, mournful reflection, focused on their youth, their letters, and the human cost of a war that consumed them before they ever got to live full lives. But a separate, far more contentious site of memory exists at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where the souls of Japan's war dead, kamikaze pilots included, are formally enshrined alongside convicted war criminals from the same conflict, a combination that has made the shrine a source of ongoing diplomatic tension with China, South Korea, and other nations that suffered under Japanese occupation. Visits to Yasukuni by sitting Japanese prime ministers regularly provoke international controversy precisely because the shrine's framing treats all of Japan's war dead, regardless of what they did or were ordered to do, as figures worthy of the same solemn honor, collapsing an enormously complicated moral history into a single, simplified narrative of national sacrifice. That tension between honoring the individual humanity of teenagers who were manipulated and coerced into flying to their deaths, and refusing to let that same honor launder the broader war effort that put them there in the first place, has never fully been resolved in Japan's own reckoning with this period. And it shows up every single year in the debates that resurface around each anniversary of the war's end. There's a particular kind of horror embedded in that final detail, because it forces you to hold two things in your mind at once that don't comfortably fit together. The same man who stood in front of young pilots and told them their sacrifice would keep the homeland from ruin spent his final 15 hours of life in agony, apologizing to the ghosts of those exact men. Neither the propaganda that built this campaign nor the popular post-war image of blind fanaticism captures what actually happened in Japan between October 1944 and August 1945. What actually happened was something far more human and far more disturbing. A nation's military leadership, staring down inevitable defeat, systematically built a machine that took its own most idealistic, obedient young citizens and asked them to die for a cause that even some of its architects seemed to privately recognize, in their final hours, might not have been worth what it cost. It also helps to understand just how quickly this entire apparatus had to scale to meet the demands the Japanese high command placed on it. What began as a single improvised unit at Mabalakat Airfield in October 1944 grew, within less than a year, into a nationwide recruitment and training pipeline running through multiple bases across the home islands, drawing from university student pilot programs that had originally been designed to train conventional aviators for a war effort that increasingly had no aircraft or fuel left to support conventional flying at all. Fuel shortages by the final months of the war were severe enough that many kamikaze pilots received only a handful of actual practice flights before their final mission, some logging barely enough hours in the air to safely take off and hold a heading, let alone handle an aircraft in genuinely difficult conditions. That scarcity became its own quiet, unspoken argument for the tactic among Japan's military planners, since a pilot who could barely fly conventionally was, in the war machine's brutal calculus, of more use crashing directly into a target than attempting a bombing run. He likely lacked the skill to complete successfully anyway. It is difficult to overstate how coldly logical that calculation was, and how completely it stripped away any pretense that these missions were only ever about honor rather than simple, grinding wartime arithmetic about which resources Japan had left and how to extract maximum value from young men it had already decided it could not otherwise protect. That's the part of the story worth sitting with long after the historical details fade, because it isn't really a story about airplanes or naval tactics at all. It's a story about how easily institutions, when desperate enough, can convince young people that dying quietly and completing an assignment is the same thing as honor. How quickly beautiful language like divine wind and cherry blossoms can be deployed to make an unbearable choice feel inevitable rather than optional. Every one of us, at some point, faces a much smaller version of what those pilots faced in Chiran: pressure from an institution, a family, a culture, or a crowd, to complete something we privately doubt simply because everyone around us has already agreed to go along with it, and stepping back feels like a kind of death in itself. The lesson buried inside this history isn't really about Japan or the Pacific War specifically. It's about staying alert to the moment when the language surrounding a decision starts sounding more beautiful than the decision itself actually is, because that's usually the exact moment worth stopping and asking the question those young men, sitting in Tome Torihama's restaurant with a cup of sake in front of them, rarely got the chance to ask out loud. If this kind of history moved you the way it should, take a second to hit that like button, drop a comment with the story you want covered next, and subscribe so it lands in front of you the moment it's ready. History like this deserves an audience that actually sits with it rather than scrolling past, and the only way that happens is if people who care keep passing it along. 80 years later, the airfield at Chiran is quiet, a peaceful museum where visitors walk past photographs of teenage faces and red letters written by young men in the final hours of their lives. Men who never got to grow old, never got to see whether the world they died defending was actually worth what it cost them. Somewhere in that quiet museum sits Ryoji Uehara's letter, still expressing doubt about a war that ended exactly the way he seemed to privately fear it would. The divine wind that gave this campaign its name was supposed to be a force of nature that saved Japan from destruction the way it had 7 centuries earlier. Instead, it became the name for something manufactured entirely by human hands, a machine built out of honor, obedience, and desperation. And the 4,000 young men who flew into it never got the chance to find out if there was ever another way home.